The sound of laughter echoed across the quiet suburban street, but it was not the kind of laughter that came from joy. It was sharp, mocking, and filled with the cruel delight of people who had chosen a target. That target was me. I had lived in this neighborhood for less than a year, and already the so-called community leaders had marked me as an outsider. They sneered at the way I kept my yard, complained about my car being too old for their perfect street, and whispered when I walked past with my coffee in the mornings. At first, I ignored them. After all, I had moved here for peace, not drama. But peace was something these bullies had no intention of giving me. It started small anonymous notes on my doorstep telling me to follow the rules, though no rules had been broken. Then came the sarcastic comment at block gatherings, always wrapped in fake politeness. But things escalated quickly when I decided to host a small weekend barbecue in my backyard, inviting a few friends over. The smell of grilled food carried through the air. The sound of music filled the evening, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of belonging. That was when they appeared, three of them, self-appointed enforcers of the neighborhood, stormed over with sour expressions and crossed arms. They shouted about noise, about unauthorized gatherings, about how people like me were not a good fit for their community. My guests fell silent, embarrassed, while I stood my ground. I reminded them calmly that I had checked the HOA rules. There was no restriction against a private barbecue. But bullies never want fairness. They want control. Their leader, a man named Rick, smirked as he pulled out his phone. Fine. Let's see what the police have to say about this. My stomach tightened as I realized what they were doing. They were not just trying to embarrass me, they were trying to intimidate me into submission. The others chuckled, Egingimon, already imagining the humiliation of me being put in my place in front of my friends. Within minutes, flashing lights appeared at the end of the street. My guests shifted nervously. The bullies stood taller, convinced they had won. But what they did not know, the truth that would shatter their smug confidence, was that I was not just any ordinary homeowner. My background, my profession, and my connections told a very different story. And as the officers stepped out of their cars, the bullies were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. Because when you weaponize lies and cruelty, you had better be prepared for the truth to hit back harder than you ever imagined. The suburban street was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every whisper and laugh stand out like a spotlight. Rows of manicured lawns and pristine houses lined the block, each property a statement of wealth and control. But beneath the surface of this picturesque neighborhood, unspoken hierarchies ruled, and I, new to this community, was about to learn that not everyone welcomed outsiders. I had moved in just a few months earlier, seeking peace, fresh air, and a sense of freedom from the chaos of my old city apartment. My home was modest compared to the surrounding estates, but it was mine, carefully chosen, painstakingly renovated, and full of the small comforts that made life feel complete. Yet, no amount of charm or good intentions could shield me from judgment. From the very first week, I felt the subtle hostility. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as I mowed the lawn, exchanged curt nods that barely passed for civility, and whispered when I walked past. Their eyes held suspicion, as if I had stepped into a world that belonged exclusively to them. At first, I tried to ignore it. After all, this neighborhood promised calm and order, and I had no desire to spark conflict. But people like this never let an outsider slide unnoticed. The passive-aggressive notes started appearing on my doorstep. Reminders about HOA rules I hadn't broken, warnings about proper conduct, and thinly veiled threats about being a poor fit for the neighborhood. I read them, shook my head, and threw them away. Let them stew in their small-minded outrage. Even the small block gatherings brought tension. Conversations were polite, but laced with judgment. Every smile felt rehearsed, every compliment weighed down with hidden critique. And then, the whispers began quiet. Murmurs behind closed doors and garage windows, questioning why I lived here, what I did for a living, and whether I fit in with the rest of the street. I tried to remain invisible, keeping my yard tidy, my interactions minimal, and my life private. But peace is fragile when cruelty thrives on the illusion of power. One Saturday, I decided to host a small backyard barbecue. Nothing extravagant, just a few friends, some grilled food, and the hope of enjoying a quiet afternoon. The smell of charcoal and sizzling meat drifted down the street, mingling with laughter and music. For the first time since moving in, I felt a sense of belonging, a temporary escape from the invisible scrutiny that had haunted every step I took. That was when they arrived. 3 figures appeared at the edge of my lawn, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, faces twisted with authority and contempt. They were self-appointed enforcers of the neighborhood's unwritten rules, and they had made it their mission to intimidate anyone who dared step out of line. Their leader, a man named Rick, stepped forward, chest puffed, with the arrogance of someone convinced that the world revolved around his judgment. "You can't do this here," he barked. "This is private property. You're disturbing the neighborhood." I took a deep breath and remained calm. I've checked the HOA rules. There is no restriction against a private gathering in my own backyard. The sneers on their faces widened. To them, rules didn't matter. Control mattered. And now, they had a target. Rick's lips curled into a smirk. He pulled out his phone, tapping the screen like a man about to deliver a masterstroke of humiliation. Fine. Let's see what the police have to say about this. In that moment, I realized their intent wasn't just intimidation, it was escalation. And in a community that prized appearances above all else, the next few minutes would determine whether I caved under pressure or proved them wrong. The tension hung thick in the air, the laughter of my friends silenced by the looming threat. And while the sun cast long shadows across the lawn, a storm was brewing, one that would change everything. The moment Rick tapped his phone, a wave of tension swept across the backyard. My friends froze, their hands mid-lift holding plates or drinks. The air, once filled with the comforting aroma of grilled food, now felt thick with hostility. Rick and his accomplices exchanged smug glances, clearly anticipating the humiliation that would soon unfold. "You're going to regret this," one of them hissed, stepping closer, towering over my small table. His voice dripped with condescension, as if mere proximity could intimidate me. I inhaled slowly, steadying myself. I knew their power was not in law or logic, it was in fear, in the illusion that their threats carried weight. And I also knew one thing. Fear was their ally, but truth was mine. "Please, Rick," I said. my voice calm but firm. "I've already checked everything. This gathering is fully within my rights. There's no law or HOA rule that you're enforcing. So if you want to escalate this, I suggest you do it respectfully." The audacity of my response seemed to confuse them for a split second. Rick's jaw tightened. "Respectful? You think you can lecture us?" He laughed harshly. "We're the ones protecting this neighborhood. You don't belong here." Their words, sharp and biting, stung, but I refused to flinch. Every insult, every accusation only strengthened my resolve. I had survived worse than passive-aggressive neighbors and entitled bullies. I had built my life on standing firm, and I would not let this petty display undo that. Before I could respond further, Rick's hand shot to his phone again. "I'm calling the police. Let's see how they like your little party." My stomach tightened, and the scene felt surreal. My friends exchanged worried glances, some whispering, some shifting nervously. The very thought of flashing lights, sirens, and an authoritative presence descending on my backyard should have been terrifying. But instead of fear, I felt clarity. This was my moment not to cower, but to reveal who I really was. Seconds later, the distant wail of sirens cut through the tension like a knife. Heads turned. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, drawn to the drama. Rick's smirk widened. He believed victory was moments away. "Just wait," he said smugly. "You'll see what happens when we call for backup." But what Rick did not know, and what the world was about to see, was that I had the truth on my side. My background, my connections, and my knowledge of the rules meant that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a setup for humiliation for them. And I was ready. The officers arrived, stepping out of their cars with professional composure. Rick hurried forward, phone still in hand, ready to narrate a version of events skewed in his favor. But as I calmly presented the necessary documents, evidence, and context, his confidence began to crumble. The laughter of his cronies faded. Their smirks turned into glances of disbelief. The tide had turned. The confrontation, once stacked against me, was now mine to control. And in that charged moment, I realized something powerful. Bullies only win when truth and composure are absent. Stand firm, speak clearly, and they unravel before your eyes. By the time the confrontation reached its climax, the backyard had shifted from a battlefield to a stage. My friends watched in awe as authority and arrogance collided with courage and preparation. Rick's face, once smug and dominating, betrayed the first signs of regret. And just like that, the scene that began with threats, mockery, and intimidation transformed into a lesson in humility, one that Rick and his allies would not soon forget. The officers paused, observing the tension in the backyard. Rick stepped forward, phone still in hand, eager to assert authority. He expected compliance, confusion, and embarrassment from me, the target of his arrogance. He did not expect truth. I straightened, meeting his gaze calmly. "Officers, please allow me to clarify," I said, my voice steady. I handed over my documents, permits, HOA approvals, and a detailed record of all neighborhood regulations. Every accusation he had made was meticulously countered, and the evidence spoke louder than any words could. Rick's smirk faltered. His allies exchanged nervous glances. A subtle murmur rose among my guests as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The power dynamic had shifted. But that's not all, I continued. Beyond the permits and rules, there's another fact that everyone here should know. I paused, letting the weight of my words hang in the air. I am not just hosting a backyard gathering, I oversee this entire community. This land, this neighborhood, every property under the HOA falls under my management. A stunned silence fell. Rick's hand trembled over his phone. The smile drained from his face. The officers exchanged glances. Realizing that the confrontation was no longer about a backyard barbecue, it was about a gross misjudgment of authority. You manage this neighborhood? One officer asked, incredulous. Yes, I replied evenly. And all these actions, threats, accusations, calling emergency services unnecessarily are violations of protocol. The matter is not only inappropriate, it could have legal consequences. Rick's shoulders slumped. His allies, who had been so certain of their dominance, now looked small, defeated. Neighbors peeked from windows, mouths opened, witnessing the complete reversal. The once confident bullies had been silenced not by anger or force, but by composure, preparation, and truth. I looked around at my friends and guests. They had watched the entire spectacle unfold, unsure if I would cave under pressure or rise above it. Now, as realization dawned, admiration replaced their initial tension. The story they had expected us in of humiliation had been rewritten entirely. Rick tried to salvage dignity, but his words faltered. He muttered apologies, though they were hollow, unable to erase the embarrassment of being publicly exposed. The officers, professional and impartial, documented the incident, issuing a firm warning about misuse of emergency services. The message was clear: abuse of authority or intimidation would not be tolerated. In that moment, I understood something profound. Bullies wield power only as long as truth remains hidden. Once revealed, that same truth becomes a force far greater than anger, force, or intimidation. The backyard, which had begun the day as a battleground of mockery and tension, now felt charged with justice. Rick and his cronies slunk away, humbled and chastised, while my guests applauded quietly, some still in disbelief. The barbecue continued, the music and laughter returning, this time infused with triumph rather than anxiety. And for me, standing in my own backyard, I realized that courage, preparation, and the quiet strength to reveal truth are more powerful than any call to intimidate or control. The bullies had tried to define the narrative, but ultimately, I had written the ending. In the end, the story was not about confrontation. It was about dignity, perseverance, and the undeniable force of truth. With the bullies finally leaving, their defeat was quiet but absolute. Rick and his allies retreated down the street, their heads bowed, faces flushed with embarrassment. The humiliation they had once imagined for me had been turned back on them, amplified by the calm confidence I had maintained throughout the confrontation. My guests, initially tense and uncertain, began to breathe freely again. Plates of grilled food were returned to hands. Laughter returned to the air, and conversations resumed, but now tinged with awe. Some whispered about how composed I had been, while others shook their heads in disbelief at the sheer audacity of my neighbors' failed attempts to intimidate me. Standing in my backyard, I took a moment to reflect. The incident had been exhausting, even stressful, but it also revealed a truth that extended far beyond a single confrontation. Courage is not loud. Strength is not always visible. And true power comes not from threats or aggression, but from knowledge, preparation, and the willingness to stand firm in the face of intimidation. I realize that bullies thrive when fear is allowed to shape responses. They rely on assumptions, on silence, on the willingness of others to shrink under pressure. But once truth is revealed, once calm authority meets their aggression, their power collapses almost instantly. The police had left, satisfied that the matter was resolved without escalation. But the lesson for everyone present was clear. Misjudgment and intimidation have consequences, and underestimating someone based on appearances or assumptions can backfire spectacularly. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light across the neatly trimmed lawns and vibrant backyard, I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The day had begun with tension, with a confrontation that could have ended badly, but it concluded with clarity, justice, and dignity. I had not only protected myself, but also sent a subtle message to the community. Respect is earned through integrity, not fear. Rick and his allies would remember this encounter for a long time, not because of anger or retribution, but because the truth had been impossible to ignore. They had underestimated me, and in doing so, they exposed their own weaknesses. The barbecue continued, laughter and conversation filling the air once more, and my friends toasted quietly to the resilience that had carried us through the ordeal. It was more than a celebration of food or friendship. It was a celebration of standing strong, of proving that composure and courage triumph over bullying and arrogance. In the end, the incident became a story I would share many times, not to boast, but to inspire, to remind anyone who has ever been challenged, belittled, or threatened that they possess an inner strength they may not yet recognize, that the truth, when wielded with confidence and clarity, can turn any situation around. And as I looked out over the neighborhood, now quiet once more, I knew this. Some people will always try to intimidate, to control, to humiliate, but those who stand firm, prepared with knowledge and unshakable composure, will always prevail. The bullies had called 911, thinking they would assert dominance, but in the end, they had only revealed their own fragility, and I had shown them, and everyone watching, the undeniable power of truth.